Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Davis. For my capstone project, I chose to research human behavior related to the nature versus nurture debate. My research will show that human behavior is not only caused by nature but instead both nature and nurture. To fully understand the debate, one must first know what nature is and what nurture is. Nature typically refers to the genetics we have and how they are responsible for our behaviors. On the other hand, nurture refers to one's environment, insisting behavior is learned from our own experiences and from those around us. So how did this debate come about? Essentially, it emerged from two schools of thought. These were behaviorism and ethology. Behaviorism came from psychologist B.F. Skinner. In simple terms, it states that all behavior is the product of trial and error learning or operant conditioning, which is what Skinner is known for in his various experiments. Behaviorism, therefore, takes the side of nurture as they look to environment and the way one learns their behavior from others and experiences to explain overall behavior. On the other hand, biologist Edward O. Wilson took on ethology to describe how nature or genetics are responsible for behavior. Supporters of this believe that each species is born with a number of inherited fixed action behavior patterns that are generally not altered by the environment. It is clear that these two schools are polar opposites, thus forming the nature versus nurture debate. In addition to how the debate emerged with the two schools of thought, there have also been many scientific advancements that have led us here. Beginning in 1865, behavior genetics were introduced by Francis Galton as a way to possibly explain human behavior. Acceptance of this sciences was slow and steady up until 1924 when things picked up and twin studies emerged. However, about a decade later Nazi war crimes occurred which led people to stray away from anything relating to genetics. In 1966, Marshall Nirenberg and others won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the genetic code. Soon after came the Human Genome Project, which ultimately led to increased popularity of genetic research as well as funding. In 1960, the first book on behavior genetics was published. Genetic research became increasingly popular within the psychology field. And finally, twin and adoption studies also became more and more popular. After realizing that these studies contain a sort of missing heritability, people began to look to nurture to explain that this gap could be due to environment. What does literature say about nature? Researcher Wiesel really sums up the nature aspect when he said perhaps most disturbing to our sense of being free individuals, capable to a large degree of shaping our character and minds, is the idea that our behavior, mental abilities, and mental health can be determined or destroyed by a segment of DNA historically. Scholarship has highlighted the nature aspect because it is easier to both study and effectively convey the nature and genetic data into literature compared to that of the nurture and environment aspect of behavior. Evolutionary biologists support the nature aspect of the debate as they agree that genes play a significant role in behavior. However, they focus on the evolution of these genes and take into account that during this evolution, genes are genetically passed on but through different environments as well. Additionally, they credit behavior to whole phenotypes rather than individual genes. With phylogeny, geneticists focus on how genes work to form the brain, and the brain is what is actually eliciting the individual behaviors, rather than the genes themselves. Lastly, many studies have focused on determining how genetics are reflected into behavior, including candidate gene association and genome-wide association. Typically, the average person inherits a total of 23 pairs of chromosomes, one copy from each parent. Through my research, I found there to be two main genetic studies that were prominent to the debate, reflecting the nature side. These were the candidate gene association studies and the genome-wide association studies. Candidate gene association studies came out first. These studies looked at polymorphisms, which are variations in the DNA sequence in a particular location of a chromosome that occurs in less than 1% of the population. In these studies, researchers would focus on a small number of these polymorphisms of the same regions of a small number of genes and work to connect these specific polymorphisms to specific behaviors. These studies were typically unsuccessful because researchers would often use the same handful of genes attempting to access hundreds of behaviors. False positives were common and overgeneralization was a problem. Because of this unsuccess, genome-wide association studies were introduced. Unlike candidate gene association, genome-wide association did not start with single polymorphisms. Instead, researchers would assess large segments of the genome, which often included at least 1 million base pairs of chromosomes. This act was usually done on thousands of participants as they looked for polymorphisms that exhibit certain behaviors. These, however, were deemed unsuccessful for their missing heritability as researchers noted that hundreds and thousands of polymorphisms produce trait heritability, and when you have that many, the polymorphisms produce such a small effect size that it simply cannot be identified in a single study. What does literature say about nurture? As soon as researchers realized that genetics may not be able to tell us everything, that there was a sort of gap in the heritability, they began to look at nurture. For a while, there was a lack of literature on nurture for the simple fact that it was difficult to convey the role of nurture into accessible scholarship. However, it has gotten a lot better as researchers are continuing to find new ways the environment plays into behavior. Two of the most prominent findings were that of the non-shared environment and the nature of nurture. The non-shared environment refers to the environmental influences and encounters that are not shared by the people in your family. This concept was especially valuable in twin studies as it made up for the missing heritability that genetics was not showing. That was because twins may each have their own non-shared environment. The nature of nurture basically explains that environments can be referred to as extended phenotypes as they reflect genetic differences between individuals. This one was important as it showcases how environment and genetics really work together to determine how people behave in their individual lives. Twin studies are based on the notion that identical twins come from one single divided egg and sperm. This means that they share 100% of their genes and inherited DNA with their twin. On the other hand, fraternal twins come from two separate eggs and sperm, meaning that they only typically share around half of this DNA. This also happens to be the same amount of a non-twin sibling. By assessing twins, geneticists are able to determine if genetics truly do play a significant role in behavior. Typically, identical twins will exhibit certain behaviors at a higher rate than fraternal. While some give credit to their shared genes, others credit their shared environment, including the shared womb. Adoption studies have also been developed to control the variable of environment and correctly assess the value of the nurture aspect. I understand many people will ask why this debate is important. Isn't it just a science question? Well, the truth is, it is a question for everyone. All disciplines. For humanities, the study of humans, I think it is self-explanatory why it would be beneficial to know where human behavior comes from. For psychology, many psychologists have turned to both to explain personality disorders, genetic disorders, etc. As far as history goes, we are all familiar with the tremendous Nazi crimes. These victims were targeted because of their genes, because they were believed to be less valuable or behave differently than others based on their DNA. Finally, criminology uses both nature and nurture in their many approaches to determine why a criminal commits the acts they do. This one will be talked about more on the next slide. Debate application in criminology. Many criminologists seek to answer the question of where criminal and deviant behavior comes from. Over years, criminologists have developed multiple theories and approaches that support different sides of the debate, including environmental criminology, biological determinism, and the evolutionary neuroandrogenic theory. Environmental criminology is sort of self-explanatory in that it uses the environment to explain criminality. It assesses both physical and social characteristics of a crime area as well as the movements that bring both the victim and offender to the crime. Out of this also comes the broken window theory. This theory essentially states that when the neighborhood is not quite kept up, when it lacks resources, crime is more likely to happen. And when more crime happens, it creates sort of a domino effect in that crime elicits more to commit. Biological determinism is different as it takes the side of nature. It insists that shared behavioral norms, and the social and economic differences between men and women come from inherited and inborn distinctions. Finally, the Ana theory is a theory of nature with nurture. It essentially states that all individuals have an evolved tendency to compete for resources. The fact is that most learn how to obtain these resources in legal and socially acceptable ways while others do not. Nonetheless, criminologists now realize that genes, individual choices, and environment all overlap to determine how one behaves. The main takeaways from this project are that 1. It is no longer a debate of nature versus nurture, but rather a solution of nature and nurture. 2. Both play significant roles in determining one's behavior, contributions to one's development of personality, characteristics, and predispositions. And 3. Genetics pass down the genes through evolution that contribute to our brain, which then contribute to how we behave in the environment based on our own experiences and others around us. Thank you for your time and consideration.